Alrighty, we might get started. Okay. Hi everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which we're all zooming in from today. My name is Sophie Hickey, and I'm the convener for the Applied Sociology group at the Australian Sociological Association. I'm on Yagara Turrbal country today, so in Brisbane, Queensland, Australia. And today's talk, we're very fortunate to have Naomi Nichols join us for Social Science Week. So Social Science Week is a week in Australia to celebrate the social sciences and everything that things like sociological thinking can do to help society. And I think our speaker today has got some really cool things to share with us about that. So thanks everyone for joining. So Naomi's talk will be about 30 minutes and then we'll have an interactive Q&A session, so questions and answers after. So if you have any questions, you can pop them in the chat. But we won't get to them till after Naomi's talk. Welcome to everyone all across the world, whether you're familiar with institutional ethnography or not. I really hope you can get something out of it. We are recording the session, so please stay muted and keep your video off just because there will be a lot of participants and we don't want too much internet traffic. Okay, Naomi, over to you.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Sophie. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. It's tonight for me talking with you. I was zooming through, I can just see a few people at a time, so to see who's here, and it's nice to see some names I know from Canada as well. The talk that I've prepared is actually about 35 minutes, a little bit less, I hope, and so then we can have 25 minutes for a good talk together. Oops. I have to figure out how to make this change. There we go. So I've organized the talk today so that it recapitulates the theoretical propositions that underpin IE's promise as a sociology for people. And by this, I simply mean a sociology that is useful in discovering how our lives and experiences are organized to unfold in the ways that they do. I ground this part of the lecture in Dorothy Smith and George Smith's early articulations of institutional ethnography and political activist ethnography. In so doing, I invite us to return to the powerful ideas that inspired them to think through how sociology might be done in service of ordinary people, of community organizing, and of social movements, rather than primarily in service of scholarship, or even worse, of late, of scholarly productivity or performativity. In so doing, I will suggest that we eschew methodological doctrine in our engagement with this sociological approach in favor of methodological flexibility, creativity, and utility, particularly in moments like this where we might be responding to crises that have some urgency and where we need to act deftly. I'll talk about some of the ways I've sought to actualize this promise of a sociology for people in my own work, and also point to some lingering tensions, for me at least, with respect to IE's promise and our actual capacities as scholars to deliver on it. In recognition of the two-day scholars' strike against the continued state-sanctioned violence experienced by Black and Indigenous peoples in Canada, I reflect on some of the ways my reading of IE has evolved over the past 7 years, and the influence of critical race, feminist, and anti-colonial scholarship on my changing thinking. Opening up the conversation in this way, then, I will invite all of us to engage with the Social Science Week theme, Social Sciences During a Crisis, and invite a reflexive conversation about how we might actually, that is, accessibly and usefully, share and deploy our social science research skills as tools for systemic change. When I started graduate school in 2004, it's a long time ago, I met Alison Griffith, who passed away last year, almost at exactly this time. I miss her a lot, and I appreciate any opportunity I have, like today, to talk about her legacy. Alison introduced me to IE, and IE was also my introduction to social sciences more broadly, to sociology at all. I was immediately drawn to IE's investigative and practical orientation, particularly this idea that sociology could be a tool that we use to understand our lives in new ways and to solve the ordinary problems that we encounter every day. I also loved IE's insistence that theory wasn't the only and perhaps not even the most useful tool at a scholar's disposal, as well as appreciating the rich theoretical body of knowledge out of which IE sprung and to which, in its formulations as a sociology, it continues to contribute. I did an institutional ethnography for both my MA and my PhD research, and it served these projects really well. In the first, my MA research, I was looking at how activism was curtailed by charitable and nonprofit funding processes and federal tax law in Canada. In the second, it was a community-based project, and I was looking at how intersectoral service provision disorganized the lives and well-being of young people who are homeless or street involved. But when I was conducting my first participatory youth research project after this as a postdoc, I ran into some places where I struggled to get IE to work for us on its own. In this case, I was working in a Caribbean diasporic community in the northwest edges of Toronto, which is Canada's largest city. The research was originally framed as a project on the institutional organization of school and community safety, and IE really worked well for this original framing that we had done in order to get funding. But this focus on the institutional mediation of safety and risk did not help our team attend to the ways that young Black people experienced these institutional processes as racist and racialized. Nor did it allow me to see how my own early framing of the project as a problem of safety for at-risk youth also reflected my own experiences of racialization, most notably that I didn't employ naturally race as a means of coding or making sense of my experiences or the problem more broadly. To try to proceed to do this project without taking young people's embodied and experiential knowledge seriously, that is, that the problem wasn't just about safety and unsafety, would have been in conflict with the basic principles of participatory research, but also IE, since people's own knowledge of their lives is understood to be an ethically and epistemologically sound place to start your project. And yet all my training in IE and the feedback I was getting from senior scholars at the time was not to pursue this line of inquiry, since young people's explanations for their ongoing interactions with the police relied on an ideological gloss. This being that the problems that they were experiencing were as a result of racial profiling and racist policing. Indeed, this became the most complicated project for me to write about because on the one hand, I had a collective of scholars asking our team to show them, in IE's way, we say, show us how young Black people's daily encounters with the police or our own experiences in a youth jail where only young Black and brown boys were imprisoned were about race. And on the other hand, critical race scholars whose work I was reading voraciously and whose scholarship begins with the assumption that race punctuates every single aspect of our lives, of social life. For the first time, I began to question my own commitment to IE and to George Smith's insistence that we eschew or bracket ideological or theoretical explanations of injustice. In Political Activist as Ethnographer, in case you aren't as familiar with George's work, he was resisting popular activist explanations for the lack of medical research progress vis-a-vis the pursuit of and access to then experimental life-saving antiretroviral regimes as rooted in homophobia. This was the general explanation within the activist circles he was working in. I assume his insistence was not because he believed that the medical establishment was ideologically pure, but because pushing on this lever was likely to land HIV/AIDS activists and the medical establishment in an ideological stalemate, which was unproductive, given the urgency of the problem. If the end goal was people living with HIV rather than dying of AIDS, then activists needed to produce an account of the problem that would gain them access to the experimental treatments that they needed to survive. Like me, I'm sure George Smith was not seeking to dismiss the explanations of his friends and fellow activists. Indeed, these were the people to whom he was most accountable. But he recognized that proving systemic heteronormativity and homophobia in the medical system was unlikely to lead, in a timely way at least, to the systemic changes he and fellow organizers wanted to see in terms of access to treatment. I similarly did not want to find myself trying to prove to teachers and the police that even though, and maybe even because, race is not used as a concept around which institutional action pivots, institutional processes, for example, school and community safety processes, could still be profoundly racist in their material effects. I wanted to begin the conversation in a different place, one that got us moving towards changes, but without sidelining or failing to acknowledge the expressed concerns and insights of those young people I was working with. When young Black people said they were harassed by the police because they were Black, my response could not be to dismiss this explanation as ideological, even if we both agreed that race is a social construct. As this ideological construct is taken up socially, that is, as in all the ways that it's denied and neutralized and whitewashed institutionally, as well as all the ways that it becomes an important tool of consciousness raising and liberation, it has a profound and evolving material ramifications for young people's lives and for their well-being. These are the basic assumptions of critical race feminist scholars, and I found it important politically and ethically to hold on tight to them rather than bracket them, particularly in these settings where people activate individualized post-racial colorblind explanations for the injustices people are experiencing. When I was leading this project, I participated in human rights policy dialogues, research conversations, and discussions of early findings with the police and with corrections officers and government personnel who all continued to deny the possibility of systemic anti-Black racism, even though we could all see that the jail was filled with Black and brown boys, that the schools and neighborhoods with the highest numbers of Black young people also ranked highest in terms of vulnerability indicators used by the school board and the city, and that these same schools and neighborhoods had the highest numbers of police on the streets. Framing the problems that young people were experiencing in terms of individual pathologies, which corrections officers insisted, or as problems of colorblind institutional processes, as some of my colleagues were suggesting, both felt like untenable choices for me, even though either might have avoided the ideological or theoretical impasse I often found myself navigating. Because I remained committed to working with young people's knowledge of their lives is profoundly shaped by race and racism, I found it difficult to use IE in this juncture, to discover how the absence of something, racial knowledge, race as an institutional construct, disaggregated race-based data, could actually be key to the institutional organization of the experiences of racism that they described. So to get unstuck, I did a couple of things. First, I began actively reading outside of IE and teaching outside of IE, especially focusing on critical race, feminist scholarship, anti-colonial literature, and going back to the beginnings of these scholarly traditions, critical indigenous scholarship, queer theory, and Marx, reading Marx, and discussing these readings with other early career scholars and with my students. I went back and I reread Dorothy Smith's early books, and then I began speaking with her about her own early thinking and her engagements with Marx, and what she'd been hoping to do with IE as a sociology. I wanted to understand how IE had come to be regarded by other scholars as a technical mapping exercise that showed how this or that institutional process was textually organized, but which had become divorced from the foundational liberatory commitments that had drawn me to the social sciences in the first place. It was the reason I was here. And I wanted to see if IE could still be useful given the increasingly participatory work I was doing and my desire to work in ways that did not contribute to epistemic injustice, even inadvertently, by conveying to participants, in this case very young people, that their sense-making practices and knowledge were somehow insufficient or wrong-headed. I'm happy to say, because I've been asked to talk about IE, that at the end of all this soul searching, I still believe that IE is one of the most promising sociological approaches, but for me, its promise, that is its political strength and its utility, is linked to a non-dogmatic scholarly engagement with its foundational commitments, rather than technical adherence to a specific set of methods. As such, I offer the following really small list of ontological, epistemic, and ethical principles that currently guide my approach to IE and that I've distilled from rereading some of Dorothy Smith's work. So for institutional ethnographers, the social has no existence independent of people, actual breathing, feeling, doing bodies that are different from one another. We can begin to discover how social life gets put together or coordinated or organized, no matter how you want to say it, from people's direct experiences of it, rather than from the null point of a generalized other constructed sociologically. All accounts of the social are produced by actual embodied people whose work is caught up in and contributes to the textually organized modes of thinking and action. These are the ruling relations through which contemporary social life is organized. And then finally, that our raison d'etre, or our work as sociologists, is to produce knowledge that is useful to people, trying to understand how their experiences are connected to and shaped by social and political economic relations that are not fully discernible from the grounds of direct experience. At its core then, IE seeks to figure out how actual people are entered into the objectified relations that Smith describes as institutional or ruling relations. That is, the relations of objectified consciousness and organization through which our lives and experiences unfold. Often, tracing texts and textually organized sequences of action can be important to this process of discovery. But a non-dogmatic orientation to IE means that we have to be open to other ways of discovering how people come to know and how they come to do the things they do in the ways that they do. Indeed, some of the most interesting contemporary IE scholarship for me at this moment is concerned with how knowledge is produced and used in ways that contribute to or legitimate material inequalities. When one approaches their sociological practices in this way, seeking to discover how one group of people comes to know, for example, that a particular policing practice, such as the production of community safety notes, is racist, and another group comes to see the same set of practices as a race-neutral aspect of their everyday legitimate work, represents a possible line of inquiry rather than an ideological deadlock, to be avoided in the pursuit of an indisputable scientific account. Indeed, at a moment characterized by increasingly polarized and polarizing knowledge, discourse, policy, and practice, perhaps this is precisely the tact we should be taking, using our skills as institutional ethnographers to investigate the social organization of knowledge and its significance to what is commonly understood as the global knowledge economy. Like Marx did with capital, perhaps we might take this hyper-reality or this realm of abstractions and fundamentally reconnect it with the grounds of experience from which it emerges and through which it acquires its ossified status as a thing or an entity to which we are all subject and through which our lives and opportunities are profoundly shaped. This would require collective effort on our parts, a global pooling of our IE analyses, much like Alison Griffith and Dorothy Smith did in Under New Public Management, such that we are able to show how this thing we call the knowledge economy is comprised of and organizes our work as academics, as public servants, as teachers, social workers, mothers, service users, and so on. For the rest of this talk, I want to describe some of the ways I've tried to do this on a minor scale in my own work. I will also spell out how I've been trying to apply IE's particular epistemic, ontological, and ethical commitments with non-academic collaborators and participatory research teams to address the issues or concerns that we have deemed important. One of the primary benefits of doing IE with participants directly is that they come to see the things that they've experienced in their lives as personal failings or struggles, as things that have an institutional or systemic dimension, that is, as reflecting institutionally organized patterns of inequality shaping the experiences of other people across time and space. In a project I did a couple of years ago, I worked with collaborators at a nonprofit organization that experiments with the use of arts and philosophy as tools for transforming social, civic, and institutional relations. They were struggling to capture and convey the social impacts of their work, an imperative that they receive from current and potential funders. To do this project, we spent months working with the organization to understand what the people who work there do every day, to map with them how one person or one team's work connects to another, and how these sequences of coordinated activity connect to the change goals that the organization is pursuing. We also studied all of their funding and other organizational documents, including a social impacts measurement framework that they had received as an in-kind contribution from KPMG. Many of you will know that this is a global accounting firm, and if it was strictly an IE for scholarly purposes, this would have been a trail to follow up into the relations of ruling to understand how these for-profit global accounting firms were reorganizing the nonprofit sector in nation states around the world. That wasn't our aim, though. We were trying to do something very practical for this organization. So ethnographically then, our research required us to deduce, because we were working much more pragmatically, to deduce both the internal and external logics that shaped people's work in the organization and the textually organized processes through which these logics and practices became stitched together over time to create the range of organizational struggles that people were talking about with us in interviews. This ethnographic approach allowed us to trace how continuous economic precarity shaped the organization's slow movement away from its activist and artistic origins towards a social innovation mandate that was idiosyncratically coupled with prescribed and top-down social change deliverables. Further, it was clear that the reason that the other social impacts framework hadn't ever been effectively employed within the organization was not simply the result of an evaluation capacity building gap, which was how it was explained, but reflected the imposition of a range of institutional reporting demands from funding institutions in other sectors that position this organization as having to feed into their impact evaluations, focusing on individual level indicators of school perseverance improvements, health improvements, that were at odds with the systemic change mandate of the organization and the scope of their activities, which were about philosophy, participatory government, and artistic interventions to create experiences of curiosity, joy, connectivity, and political self-efficacy. Once we'd identified the locus of the problem in the organization, then the organization's failure to do what funders were asking was revealed in a new light. They pivoted away from demonstrating social impacts as narrowly defined by their funders and towards a praxis orientation enabled by reflexively organized feedback loops. Throughout the course of this multi-year collaboration, we read IE together and combined these readings with the principles of qualitative evaluation to co-create a knowledge-generating system that allowed our collaborators to generate and use reflexive feedback cycles to understand how and where their work made a difference in the lives of the people they were working with, and in their larger aims, in terms of their larger aims of creating a more inclusive society, as well as enabling them to speak coherently to the concerns of funders and other external stakeholders concerned with impact measurement. IE usefully informed our understanding of the roots of their organizational struggles that many nonprofit organizations face, and devise a pragmatic response, but only because we remained flexible and methodologically undogmatic in our approach. We weren't looking for scholarly purity, and in fact, we didn't even publish anything for a scholarly audience. This project was very much oriented to addressing an ordinary need that many organizations like this one face every day. We wanted to help them reconnect back to the early motivations for their work, which were to combat epistemic injustice by co-creating artistic and political interventions with people who'd been historically marginalized from cultural and political life. Somewhat surprisingly, this project was actually part of a larger grant to study the move towards measuring social impacts of social science research in the academy. The evolution of the project towards my nonprofit collaborators' interest in social impact evaluation allowed me to see that a similar complex of economic and political relations was reflected across these distinctive institutional settings, although clearly my participation in them from the standpoint of an academic, an early year academic, enabled different outcomes than it would have had I been working in the community organization. There was a common logic, austerity, return on investment, and performance-based assessment underpinning accounting, governance, and reporting processes in both contexts. And that these same rationalities also underpinned the challenges that young people were describing to me in research interviews. The ordinary encounters with social institutions like schools, housing projects, homeless shelters, the courts, and child welfare offices were profoundly influenced by the same growing gap between available resources and demands for services, as well as the ways resources and work were accounted for institutionally. The relentless move away from publicly funded operating grants and towards contract, project, performance, and enrollment-based funding schemes across the nonprofit, the human services, and academic sectors have produced a continually rising set of performance indicators or expectations that often feel divorced from and at odds with the availability of resources and the substantive, meaningful work of our respective fields. For myself and for many colleagues and collaborators who fought to gain entry into our respective professions during this time of rising expectations and diminishing resources, while also rearing our children into this uncertain future, these relations have shaped an embodied response that, while not universal, has shared dimensions. Continuous low-grade worry and fear, punctuated with periods of debilitating psychoaffective reactions. And here I'm using deliberately this term of Frantz Fanon's psychoaffective responses here, so as not to work people's experiences into pathologizing diagnostic criteria, but to remind us that we are in bodies and that our bodies and minds are affected by the social relations we participate in, and that these social relations, while not universal in how they enter into and shape our diverse lives, may have some common dimensions which are worth noting. The young people I work with in a research capacity are also caught up in these relations, but in vastly different ways than I am, often as service seekers, service users, and as those who are the unwilling subjects of socio-legal, health, or educational interventions. While I and the adult professionals with whom I'm friends and collaborators might suffer emotional and physical exhaustion because we are continually seeking to address people's needs with insufficient resources and increasing demands on our already frayed minds and limited time, some of the young people I work with regularly experience the life-threatening consequences of their participation in reflexively organized institutional relations that are designed to enable oversight, management, and performance-based assessment with respect to the insufficient housing, harm reduction, mental health, legal aid, and other resources upon which they depend. I'm not being hyperbolic when I describe these as life-threatening conditions for some young people. Young people growing up without stable housing and experiencing acute poverty, even in a rich country like Canada, are more likely to suffer from a range of health difficulties and die before they're 30. Most of my research conducted over a decade has emerged from the problems that these young people experience in their everyday lives. Police harassment, conflict with the child welfare system, getting kicked out of school, having no money, living on the streets or in unsafe housing, and difficulties accessing high quality and timely mental health, substance use, and/or life-sustaining services. For the young people I work with, these problems can become crises of confidence in public institutions and the state, as well as tangible threats to their well-being and their survival. Collectively, young people's experiences of injustice and inequality point to systemic patterns of exclusion and neglect, that is institutionalized inequities, entrenched over time and space, which contribute to the punctuated crises facing Canada at this moment: opioid poisonings and deaths, financialization of housing and increasing homelessness, racial disparity and police violence, poverty and health outcomes, and a growing economic divide between rich and poor. And I clearly, when I time myself and I'm not doing an actual presentation, I must speak a lot faster because I still have a few more pages, so I won't try to race and do really quickly. But I wanted to just talk about two different projects that I'm working on right now that seek to bring into view and address some of these reflexively organized institutional relations that condition the patterns, these acute crises that we're experiencing right now. And also I'll just try to summarize them quickly rather than going through everything that I had originally thought I would cover or talk about today. So one project is a participatory youth research project that I co-lead with one of my doctoral students, Jane Malenfant. And we do this project with a team of young people who have experiential knowledge of poverty, homelessness, addiction, mental illness, and systemic racism and heteropatriarchy, as well as the systems and services meant to alleviate these things. And we spent a long time working with this group of people, doing a bunch of training with them and legal analysis with some law students, as well as then a year collecting data and coding the data with them. And in this case, we were doing institutional history interviews, so not something that I've seen other institutional ethnographers do, over a series of interviews, inviting them to construct accounts, almost like a case file of all of their institutional interactions over their lifetimes, as well as working with them to identify particular moments in their developmental trajectories where interventions did or didn't happen. Given the urgency of the housing crisis in Canada and the difficulties faced by young people growing up on the streets, and experiencing acute poverty, we weren't really interested in doing an exploratory IE. We wanted to have, our project had some urgency to it. And we came to the table with our team with a shared desire to prevent and end homelessness in Canada for young people. And so the research design we came up with reflected this urgent aim. We didn't want to generate new knowledge about what it was like to be homeless. We knew a lot about this. What we wanted to do was to generate new knowledge about what had to change in institutions in order to prevent young people from experiencing homelessness. The other project that I'm working on right now is interested in data and evidence that is used in institutional decision-making processes to legitimate the distribution and management of resources and the actions of various state systems. And I won't describe it in any great detail, but we've been mapping the data that condition young people's experiences in and leaving the child welfare system in one province, and now working with stakeholders across that system to identify places where different data infrastructure and data processes would lead to different outcomes for young people, as well as using it as an anchor ethnographically to start to connect the dots between the objectified realm of data systems and the actual social work practices that produce the data through which the system is now monitored and deployed. Again, with the idea that in reconnecting the threads between these, the realm of data and the realm of lived experience, we might think about how to reorganize our orientation to data such that we're producing a different kind of outcome for young people. One of the things that I think is most evident so far in the second project, this data project, is that all of the data processes that we create have been created to serve particular institutional aims, and many of them in the child welfare system, as I imagine you will know, are quite carceral in orientation. And so the data, rather than actual like neutral information, bits of information, are very political. And I think what we can do is actually take that accepted proposition among critical data scientists and show precisely where the data are used to legitimate diminished justice, injustices across the system. I also then had a bunch that I wanted to talk about how COVID had changed everything, which I won't share with you, but we're sort of slow on all of our analytic work collectively. And I have a big file of unanalyzed transcripts, uncoded even transcripts on my desktop that I will hopefully get to one day when my kids finally go back to school. And I'll just move towards a conclusion. The one thing that I have always found difficult in all of the projects that I've led that are participatory is actually doing the systemic fine-grained analysis that an institutional ethnography requires of a person in a group or in a political process. We've been able to often do quite high level and I think still useful analyses as a group, but the text type sequence of analysis that is often at the heart of an IE is really boring and really the kind of painstaking thought work that I tend to do alone in my office. So I wanted to end sort of thinking about this, that I had proposed the topic of this whole talk being that this analytic work done together was really a transformative, potentially transformative experience for people in terms of connecting from individual to collective experience. And I think this is true in a broad way. But I also wonder if perhaps we're going about this in the slightly wrong way. As it becomes an increasingly accepted idea, at least among many activists and scholars, and even some government people are now espousing that this is true, that injustices have a systemic basis. One thing we could do as institutional ethnographers is to use our sociological tools to help pinpoint precisely where aspects of institutional policy, practice, discourse, thought, decision-making, resource distribution, and so forth have systemic or structural inequalities baked into them and how they need to change. And it may be actually that we don't do this work always in a participatory way, even though I do love participatory research. Indeed, we may be wise to recognize that our offerings as scholars are not more important or the most important in a collective change-making effort, and do not require that everyone participates in the scholarly work. Rather, that we see this as one piece of a change-making process of which many types of work are going to be needed, and that we simply link up to others who are also doing the other kinds of work that are part of what would be a widespread systemic change effort. And that I think perhaps some of our insistence that all scholarly, or that scholarly work, if it's to be deemed progressive or just, is participatory, is about our own egos, and we might let go of that and see it as not more or less important than any other form of action that is required in our efforts to change the world. So that's me. I'm going to stop the share. I'm going to transfer the power back to Sophie.
Thanks so much, Naomi. That was awesome. I don't know how you do applause in Zoom, but really well done. I thought I'd take a moment just to reintroduce if people missed the little beginning bit. So I'm Sophie Hickey, based in Yagara Turrbal country in Brisbane, Australia. We've had guest speaker Naomi Nichols based in Canada. Today it's being hosted by the Australian Sociological Association, thank you, for Social Science Week. So bringing public awareness, I guess, to the value of social science. And obviously, as an applied sociologist, as a participatory action researcher, as an institutional ethnographer, I might be a bit biased in saying that I can definitely see the value in the work, the research that you're doing. And I'm sure lots of people have got questions, so please chuck it down in the chat box. In the meantime, I might kick off with one. Given we've got quite a diverse audience phoning in from all around the world, some might have loads of experience in institutional ethnography, some may have never heard of it before, but hopefully people have gotten a bit of a understanding about how it can be a super useful research method. So the recording will be accessible on the TASA website, on the YouTube channel. More details later. I'll deal with the comments later. They're really distracting. So sorry. So yes. So one thing that I was drawn to with IE was definitely the utility of it. So like you mentioned, you know, sociology for the people, really harnessing it to for this opportunity to look at things a bit differently, to see how institutions are organizing or disorganizing our work, whether or not we like it. And I just wanted to say, for people who are new for institutional ethnography listening in today, where are some places they can start to learn more about how they might want to use it in their work?
Well, I think conferences are often places where I get to learn more about how other people have used it in their work. We often gather, institutional ethnographers gather at the International Sociological Association. There's a working group within it that is for IE folks. And also at the SSSP, the Society for the Study of Social Problems, which is part of or connected to the ASA, the American Sociological Association. And so it's one place where I get often like a buzzy feeling about, like, excitement about the kinds of work that people are doing, especially students. I really love seeing the way students continue to bring in other methods, other ideas that have some synergy with institutional ethnography. A lot of my students have been doing work that boundaries, you know, anarchist approaches or indigenous research methodologies, other participatory work. I also read, like I go back and read and then reread and then teach all of Dorothy's work. I've really liked going back to her early formulations of thinking, like that predate institutional ethnography, and rereading those. And she's just written a new book with Alison Griffith that I remember them both talking about a lot towards the later part of Alison's life, and I'm looking forward to reading that. The other thing I've done, and I have participated in other people doing, which is I think why I like it, are what I call like anti-conferences, but I have organized at McGill before I left this summer, anti-conferences where I would have Dorothy come and then other senior IE scholars, Alison Griffith, Lauren Eastwood, Marge DeVault, and talk with graduate students. Graduate students would share their work, they'd receive feedback in a non-judgmental way. We would spend less time on presentations and more time on discussions of each person would do like a mini presentation and we discuss it. And I think I went to one of those as a graduate student that Marge DeVault organized at the University of Syracuse, and I loved it. And I participated in one with the Nordic IE network. I think these opportunities also really matter if we can get funding to have people come together to share and learn. It really, oh, and Maren, I just see your comment. Maren also organized events like this at Praxis. So Praxis International, an organization in Minnesota in the US, but I think these opportunities as well that are less formalized, where we can share the like real struggles in a non-performative space, I think also really matter. Ooh, and I don't know if everyone's seeing the chat, but Anisha just said that she has 15 memberships to the Society for the Study of Social Problems available for graduate students who may not be able to afford to come. So you should contact her.
Totally. Thanks so much. So we've got a few questions in the chat. And so the first one, oh, hang on, they keep coming up, keeps moving. Katie has said, you mentioned we know a lot about what experiencing homelessness is like already, and we need to shift towards looking at how young individuals become homeless. Could you expand on this a bit, please?
Sure. It was actually, I might have misspoke, is that we wanted to focus on how to make sure they didn't become homeless, that they were prevented from becoming homeless. I think there's been a lot of research, traditional sociological and other social science research does the thing where it describes other people to other people. So it would be like, what's it like to be a homeless youth? This would be written academically up for an academic audience so that they understand what it's like to be homeless, or to people becoming service providers so that they understand what it's like to be homeless. Our interest was not to contribute to this. We saw it as politically less salient, but also contributing to processes of objectification and the production of knowledge that is often used to rule people, to organize services for those young people, but in ways that they didn't always agree with or see as valuable. So our orientation was rather to change, to invite young people to work with us to study government. That's how we pitched it to young people with our youth team that we were working with. So myself and Jane would co-interview with one of our youth collaborators, our youth research team members, another young person, about their experiences in various interlocking institutional contexts or settings, and focus our analytic work, or the focus of our ongoing analytic work, is on pinpointing precisely which interlocking institutional relations contributed to their homelessness or could have been leveraged differently to prevent them from becoming homeless, so that we can come back to government with very concrete demands, basically, or recommended actions. And this was in part because I had been studying how research enters into policymaking process and the reliance on evaluation-based research findings as a tool for policymaking, but that the evaluations that were increasingly being advocated were these clinical ones, randomized controlled trials in homelessness research, which seemed bonkers to me, because then no one could ever reproduce those clinical settings in a service delivery context ever. And so we were creating falsely particular sets of outcomes that could never be reproduced in real time. And they were like wildly expensive and slow. And so I thought there must be something that we could do that was less objectifying for young people, that involved them meaningfully in the process, but that could still speak to some of the concerns of policymakers in terms of the types of evidence that they could actually use to push government. So that's a very long-winded answer to your probably simple question.
That's great. I have a question about what you said in the talk about the participatory nature of doing a group IE or a collective IE, and specifically about if you wanted to talk a bit more about that, analytic process. So you said the text action text sequence can be quite boring and individualized, and maybe some other people as well, if you have experiences doing collective group participatory type IEs, you feel free to chat. But yeah, Naomi, did you want to talk about how that part of the research process can maybe be participatory?
Well, we tend, so we have done this kind of work in teams, but it's boring and we tend to lose interest. I think it's, my teams are often young, like really young people. And so it tends to be sort of slow moving. And it feels like they've done all the coding and now we're looking at each code. And one of the frames we tried to use to make it more accessible this last project, and inspired by some other participatory researchers, was looking at points of possibility and points of failure in the interview data with young people, which were accessible sort of concepts around which we could pivot with them as we looked at each sector that young people were traversing. But again, it was fairly high level, like what were the sort of general institutional enablers and general institutional constraints. And frankly, you know, it was partly trying to do this over Zoom because it was during COVID. I think that also derailed us, like, because we needed to be able to go, we had so much data, go through each of the transcripts with young people. They were in French and English, and figure out what are all the possible institutional points of possibility and failure across every system that young people touched. And then once those were identified, try to get at a fine-grained analysis of what precisely was going wrong or right for them at each developmental and institutional juncture in their lives. It was just slow and pedantic. And in the meantime, young people lost their housing. They couldn't get access to food anymore. Sex work became very, very dangerous during COVID. People struggled again with substance use and mental health struggles that had been sort of stabilized, but COVID destabilized them. I completely crumbled under the pressure of trying to be a professor and raise my kids and also be their teacher all of a sudden. So I think it's possible. It's just the conditions have to be right, and they weren't in this case. And I've never really actualized the right conditions, maybe. But I'm also not convinced that we have to do every piece of it together, and that it may be that the pieces, we're still trying to figure this out as a team, like what are the pieces that people do want to work on, and in terms of analysis and change, and how to make sure that people get to do what they want and feel most meaningfully like engaged in or passionate about, without presupposing that everyone wants to sit and go through policy documents or workplace texts and figure out at which juncture the text coordinates a sequence of action that is problematic for young people. That's painstaking. Others, I would love to hear other ideas that are useful.
Love it. Thanks for your honest response. Yeah, definitely. If you've got any comments, guys, on that, because I know some of you have done that type of thing, it would be great to hear from you. I'll just read out some of the chat. So Annette says, as an undergraduate, thanks so much for saying you still learn from students. It encourages me to speak up. So it's lovely. Suzanne says, Praxis will publish Palgrave Handbook of Institutional Ethnography, December, January 2020. Is that 21, I'm guessing? Deborah says, thanks so much. I'm interested in your focus on finding out how things might be leveraged differently. So I think that was the context of looking the homelessness and seeing in the institutional processes, things may have happened differently to have prevented homeless, I'm guessing. And there was another one up higher from Maren saying, can you give a specific example of something you have found in an institution that contributed to racial injustices?
I have like so many examples of this. For example, in the institution where I used to work at McGill, so in academia, one of the things, you know, I was on a call this afternoon with a bunch of social nonprofit folks, across Ontario about a nonprofit data strategy that is meant to address racial inequities and racial injustices. And so we were thinking about exactly this question, Maren, about where we see racial injustice in current data practices. And I was thinking, you know, we hold universities to such a high esteem, but just, you know, a year or so ago, I was on a dissertation committee where someone had written about the only thing that consistently predicts academic failure is indigeneity. And I thought, the way we teach statistics to students, this is a doctoral dissertation, the way we teach statistics to students contributes to racial injustices and to the baking in of these ways of thinking about the power of statistics. All that the research probably suggested or indicated was that it's not chance that, you know, we see large numbers of Indigenous students struggling in school. That's not chance. But that doesn't mean that indigeneity predicts academic failure. That's a highly racist and problematic interpretation of a set of statistics in an academic context where I would have expected much better supervision, I guess, at the very least. But so all over the place, we see this in the way that when I was examining the data system for the child welfare system in Ontario, we have a huge data warehouse that houses all the data for children in the child welfare system, but there haven't been standards put in place for how race-based data are collected. So it's collected in vastly different ways across the entire system. And so none of it is actually useful in terms of tracking the developmental and other outcomes, the potential for injustice within the child welfare system, for monitoring disproportionately negative or positive outcomes as experienced by particular racial or ethnic groups in the child welfare system. The data is rendered essentially useless. It's also not available to people for that purpose, for tracking, in terms of holding the system accountable. It's not available to activists, it's not available to families, it's not even available to the social workers who put it into the system. And so these are moments where I think, you know, we're not even at the place of the basic principles of ownership and autonomy, and the whole system has been designed to enable, in this case, business intelligence is what they call it, and development for the ministry, but not to do any of the social justice work that we might do in organizations. Everything that I've ever observed in policing has racial injustice built into it from its inception. Everything about state formation in Canada, frankly, like I'm teaching social policy this fall to undergraduates. And again, I learned so much when I'm teaching. So I learned all these things about the way that the Canadian state was created that I didn't know about in terms of the past system, and how the RCMP and other Canadian policing institutions from the very beginning were organized to have not the sole purpose, but a central purpose of keeping Indigenous peoples in particular prescribed territories and repressing their movements. So, I mean, it's just everywhere once you start looking. And I suggest for any of you who have any interest in this, the scholars strike that's happening in Canada, which I think is happening on a global scale right now, about state-sanctioned violence against Black and Indigenous peoples. If you can tune into any of it, the talks have been amazing, profound, important, heartbreaking, but they speak to all of these issues.
Thanks so much, Naomi. So we just got kettle boiling. Working from home. Yes, thanks so much. I'm sure there's like still a million questions. I've still got a million questions. There's 5 minutes left, guys, or folks, as you guys say in North America. If you want to chuck your last question, flood the chat box now. So much of what you said has resonated, I'm sure, with a lot of people in the audience as well. just maybe some ways that they can keep in touch with you and or see more about your work, Naomi?
Yep, I'll put my email here, but I also, and you can email me anytime, but Lanisha was also asking about data justice or analysis and the coding processes you still need to complete. So I think partly, Lanisha, that like, the data justice was partly a rhetorical device, like a device, a frame that I put in place to get a grant. Because one of the things that you learn as an institutional ethnographer is how to navigate institutional processes like grant writing. And now I try to teach that to students. The idea that I have is that the systems that we've created, some of them are broken and there's nothing we can do about them. I actually do fear that this is the case with child welfare, and it was always designed to damage families, particular kinds of families, or to, not to damage them, but to fix them. So it was designed on the assumption that they were broken. And so I think abolitionism is the way to go with child welfare. But in the meantime, we have like hundreds of young people caught in that system and growing up in it. And so you can't just say blow it up or nothing. You have to do something about it. So the idea was that given the recent turn towards data-driven decision-making across public sectors, public systems in Canada and across the Western world, that we needed to pay attention, and that we needed to pursue just data infrastructure, just data responses. And so I work with social nonprofit data and technology organizations in this effort. And so there's a bunch of things happening under this umbrella of data justice. The Canada Research Chair that I have is connected to this as well, or is another avenue through which we're going to pursue some of these things. One of them is like experiments in data sovereignty. So I got a Canada Foundation for Innovation grant to create a community-owned, community-accountable data system. For community-based projects was primarily my initial thought, but I think, you know, listening to these conversations, participating in these conversations with people across the nonprofit sector who are interested in issues of racial justice, for example, I don't think we can wait for government to come up with a data system that's going to embed the principles that we hold most dear, that we have to think about ways outside of government systems to pursue what we want now on our own. And so I think that the data justice initiative will be opportunities through which we can pursue some of these possibilities with activists and organizers and community-based researchers and other folks. So I think it's one of those, like, my fingers are crossed we can do something cool, but I don't know at this point. I hope we can.
Thanks so much. I think that's a really motivating point to end on. And so as everyone across the world, whether you're in the Northern Hemisphere getting ready to go to sleep, whether you're about to start the rest of your workday in Australia, I hope you can take some of this home with you, or work, whatever. It's much the same these days, with you to keep you motivated about how your everyday work can continue to be connected to the people that you work with, to the, you know, the benefit of community, and the power that we can harness as citizens to make these changes in a world which we might seem a bit hopeless at times. Everyone, just thank you so much for coming. I hope that you've got something from IE, even if it's just the smallest idea of how, rather than focusing on problematizing individuals, flipping it back and problematizing these big institutions that control so much of our work. This video will be uploaded to the TASA YouTube, so the Australian Sociological Association's YouTube channel. If you did register through the Eventbrite site, I'll send an email with that link. Thank you so much, Naomi, for joining us. Thanks as well for taking time out of your evening time and away from your kids, and everyone else for joining. some wonderful comments going in the chat there. So love you and leave you. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming.
Okay, take care. Thank you, everyone.
Awesome. See you later. Bye.